Unsustainable debt burdens plague numerous countries, creating a crisis that some say is at its worst point ever. Religious communities, inspired by the Jubilee Movement, are calling for bold action to address this pressing global concern.
One of the greatest challenges that we're facing are the actual causes of poverty.
The main reason for the problems we have is linear thinking. The very fact that we think that only when you have economic growth you're doing the right thing is a problem in itself.
The challenge with something like poverty is that there are layers of systems that affect the world we live in.
We're called to take care of the least among us. We're called to leave no one behind. Why should people of faith, communities of faith, get involved in policy issues? I think those of us who are gathered here right now in Brasilia know that in all of our faith traditions, there is a demand, there is an imperative that we create a world where everyone has enough, a world where no one is left behind. So when we talk about the reality that the majority of the world's countries are struggling, are developing countries, there are reasons for that. And the dialogue that's taking place in the G20 is about the reasons there are poverty. So one of the reasons that there's poverty is that countries have too much debt. And they take on debt to try and pay their bills, and they take on more debt to pay their previous debt. We saw during the pandemic the reality that the majority of the world's countries lost decades of development. So the G20 is looking at these underlying issues of poverty, like debt, and how we address problems like debt. There are many of us, including some of the wealthiest corporations in the world, who are not paying any taxes. So the G20 is also looking to change that because they know not only do we need taxes for infrastructure, for funds to protect the environment, without that money, governments don't have the resources they need to deal with poverty. And then I think the last area that the G20 is really looking at right now along this is around how do we get economic aid to the people who need it most, and how do we ensure it goes to those people and is not used for corrupt purposes. So there are several ways that they're looking to do that. The G20, as one of the most powerful decision-making bodies on earth, has to find the money and the resources. And so one of the ways they're looking at is getting resources for what are called multilateral development banks. So all around the world, there are these banks, the Asian Development Bank, the Africa Development Bank, and their role is to provide resources to alleviate poverty, to make sure people have enough food, and be able to protect the environment. So right now, the G20 is debating how to get more money into these institutions that are the closest to poverty and can do the most to promote real economic growth and development. When we talk about the power of the faith community, one of the wonderful, powerful things we moved at the G20 during the pandemic is we won more than $650 billion in aid. 300 billion of which has now gone to developing countries. We saw how the faith community was able to move the presidents of the 20 wealthiest industrialized countries of the world to do the right thing and be able to create this new currency to deal with poverty. So all of these issues are on the wheelhouse of the G20.
One of the big challenges we face when it comes to alleviating poverty, investing in sustainable development and so on, is that countries often commit to nice targets and goals, but the delivery mechanism afterwards in living up to those commitments can be a bit challenging for governments. So the financial policies doesn't always align with, for example, the commitment to national determined contributions, the NDCs, or the overall delivery of the Paris Climate Accord or the UN 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So we need governments to commit to their obligations. We need also governments that are funding partners to deliver what they need to do. So this is a match between both the global north and the global south in actually living up to commitments. And for institutions like the World Bank or other multilateral institutions, we are of course a player in deliverance in regards to what the governments prioritize. So that's why this is an important setup of connectivity. I think that religions are often a vehicle to reach the end user in a completely different way than a government can or global organizations. So having a dialogue between multilateral organizations or governments with religious entities or in a forum like this is key to both get messages to end users, but also to understand better what is actually needed to change the lives of the most vulnerable. So the World Bank is committed to end hunger. It's a goal for us. We cannot increase food production if it's not in collaboration with stakeholders on ground. We need change of habits, change of education, change of use of, for example, fertilizer or pesticides. That's very practical. But we also need trusted voices on ground to do some of this. And faith-based organizations are trusted voices. I'm an eternal optimist, and I believe in the change that we create on an individual basis, but also in connecting with other like-minded people in regards to the political sphere, the financial sphere, the faith sphere, and so on. And yes, not all numbers are good, but we see that there are progress on a number of areas globally when it comes to poverty, when it comes to increase of food production and so on. But listen, I'm not naive, and we of course need to keep the pressure on decision makers in regards to take the right decisions to reach the UN Sustainable Development Goals, to end hunger and so on. And this is an ongoing battle, but I think if we start with ourselves and our own actions and kind of advocate for creating better, circumstances for people that can do the same, then we at least take steps in the right direction. Is it enough? Well, the future will show, but I am optimistic in regards to being able to change some of these things.
If you go back channel, like what is causing the decrease in funding for development assistance or humanitarian aid, it often is things like military spending or other types of priorities that governments have. So you can see kind of how the polarization is playing out. And I think something that many faith traditions bring is both an abundance mindset instead of the scarcity and competitive mindset, as well as really innovative and proactive solutions.
The conversation that's happening here is twofold. So the first is thinking about the imperatives of the G20, which is an agenda that's set by the 20 largest economies in the world, thinking about alleviating poverty, hunger, sustainable development goals. But we're bringing a very specific interfaith lens to those goals. And that matters because over 80% of the world identifies with a religious group. And these aren't just identities, these are identities that inform those very economies, right? If you are a Muslim farmer, then there are specific ways you interact with your economy through your faith lens. So the IF20 is bringing that, not just for economy, but also for human rights, right? We live in a polycrisis, we live in a globalized world, and unless we're bringing the faith lens to all of the urgent issues that are being faced by G20 countries, but also broadly the world, the developing world, then we're gonna have a blind spot. The challenge with something like poverty is that there are layers of systems that affect the world we live in. Maybe 100 years ago, we could look at the relationship between people, their countries, their governments, and draw more linear lines. But nothing about the world we live in today is linear. There's technology, there's the legacy of colonial practices. There are systems that fight against minority groups, indigenous people, women, children. And these layers of systems make it really complex, not impossible, but complex to address global crises like poverty. So if we can bring groups together in collaboration and try and eliminate some of those systematic barriers that come from coordination problems or market failures, or even just thinking about differences of opinions, right? Different countries think that poverty should be solved in different ways. So the beauty of coming together and thinking about these shared goals is really to try and eliminate some of those systematic barriers and say, okay, if we can agree on an agenda to alleviate poverty, if we can agree on at least some of the political or economic or religious elements that are going to serve that goal, that unified goal of alleviating poverty, then we can also pool resources and bring together the very best of civil society, of government, of the interfaith community, and work together on addressing these problems. Poverty is an enormous challenge, but we have tackled enormous challenges in the past, right? We've curbed global pandemics like AIDS, even COVID-19, although the aftermath is still being felt by many. There was global coordination strategies led by interfaith leaders, I might add. And so we do have a playbook for what this could look like, but it requires a lot of perseverance. It requires a lot of trust between these groups so we can share our best practices. And most of all, it requires an action-oriented agenda. Because of course, we can come together, we can talk about the issues, we can celebrate what we're doing as organizations. That's a missed opportunity if that conversation isn't translated into work on the ground. So the partnerships that are made at IF20, in my opinion, are more important than the panels. It should be the place where action is conceived and then implemented by the incredible organizations that have both sponsored IF20, organized it, and all the people who have given time and resources to be here. This is the most urgent cause. No doubt there's data to support that. We are inundated with data though, and so we're gonna have to think differently about how to bring playbooks together. If we each tackle our own individual issues in silos, without interdisciplinary partnerships, without interfaith partnerships, then we will plateau.
I think it is absolutely critical that various forces in global society must gather. In this case, the interfaith religious community have gathered to append themselves to the G20. And it is done in recognition of the fact that the world is in a series of intersecting crises. And if we don't arrest those crises, we may as a world face an existential crisis in which climate overruns us and we kill ourselves with conflict. And so every organized sector of global society, including the religious, must really understand that we are at the last throw of the dice. Now is the time for all hands on deck, and this is the time to make sure that we force our global leaders who make the decisions, who control the finances, who set policy, who control implementation, that they must know that we are holding them accountable, and they must know that there is no place to hide, that they must do the right thing. So what I say in this conference is that we are all very good at mopping up the water, whether it is the water that is spilling on women, on children, on trafficking, on racism and all of those kinds of things. It's very important. But they've got to take a break from the mopping in order to turn off the tap that produces the water. And therefore, the point is, we must understand that the crises we're dealing with are embedded in the structures of society and the structures of global institutions like the World Bank, like the IMF, like the United Nations, like the Security Council, and all the other organizations. You see, those other organizations are the taps from which the crises flow. And they were formed after World War I and World War II. And they were a way to mediate between nations, because essentially the conflicts that existed were between nations. However, all the crises that we're dealing with are transnational crises.